sort of special that we haven't done yet in this version of our Common Good podcast and live stream. And that is, we're going to show you an interview that was done this summer, an interview that I did with Kristen Dumais. Kristen is a historian. She's an author. She's a Vote Common Good person, too. She spoke at one of our events in Michigan, and she's written a book called Jesus and John Wayne, How Evangelicals Fractured a Faith in Our Country. So it's a great book. I think you're going to love it. This conversation feels very timely. Feels very timely in where we are. I like it in the Issues Day here on Thursdays, because it feels like the issues that she raises in this book, which have to do with the history of evangelicalism, of course, the religious right in America, but also the role that a certain kind of masculinity has played. And that masculinity narrative is really important. It strikes at the heart of so much of what's gone on in our world up until now. Just in the last few days, watching the reports come out of Atlanta from this heartbreaking murders, and hearing the narrative now that the man who committed these murders is admitting that it has to do with his own sexual addictions. And then that's interlaced with racism and masculinity and women and who the victims are and how people respond. So all of these very complex issues, they interrelate. And in our podcast, we like to take an open-eyed, positive view of the world, but we want to see the world as it is and then see what we can do to let our lights shine in the midst of it. So this conversation with Kristen, I think you're going to enjoy. I hope you're going to enjoy. And if you do, would you let us know in the comments? Even though, it's a recording, we'll still be paying attention. And if you're listening only to the podcast, we want to let you know how much we appreciate you as well for being a part of the podcast. So here is my conversation from this July with Kristen Dumais. Her book is called Jesus and John Wayne. I'll mention that again here in my introduction of her. The book has done very well. It has gotten much attention. We're so proud of this book in the work that we do at Vote Common Good, and so proud of our relationship with Kristen, and think that you're going to love it too. So here we go. Kristen Dumais and Jesus and John Wayne. The book is called Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. I mean, as somebody who likes a good, punchy subtitle and title, you certainly accomplished it with this one. It's a great one. It really comes right at it. I'm a bit of a book nerd. Just it's sort of an industry hazard. Did you pick your subtitle? Did you pick your title? Who did it, and how do you feel about it?
Oh yeah,
We'll
that's a
get
great
into the book in
question.
a minute, but how did that all come about?
I picked the title. I had it was my working title for quite a few months as I was finishing the manuscript. So and my publisher loved it, and so that was easy. It took us about 3 or 4 months of back and forth to come up with the subtitle.
Yep.
So it's a book about white evangelical masculinity and militarism, but they didn't want either of those words in the subtitle. They were too long. And so that was our challenge, to come up with, what really describes this book. And we went back and forth, and this is where we ended up. And I'm really happy with it. I do think it gets at the heart of the book itself, and each phrase takes a little unpacking, and it makes sense once you read the book. And so I really like that. The corrupted of faith works in a couple of different ways, where we're looking at obviously a negative development here, corruption. This isn't just transformation,
Yeah.
but it also suggests there's a little bit of a moral claim here, a normative claim. I'm a person of faith myself. I'm a professing Christian, and what I'm describing in this book, I'm arguing isn't the Christianity that we see in the Gospels. And so there's a critique there as well. And fractured a nation. This has enormous consequences politically for our nation, for American democracy.
Mm-hmm. And you didn't only intend, or don't intend, for this only to be a book about Donald Trump. It's actually broader than that. And you make sure I get this right. How you would argue the book. There were a set of conditions that evangelical Christianity allowed and developed and curated over time that allowed someone like Donald Trump to be the ideal message carrier for that community of white evangelical Christians in the United States, to really attach all of their political aspirations to. and
Exactly.
that is rooted in what you refer to as a masculine and muscular kind of Christianity that people with more technical terms, which you use in the book, would call, well, you should describe the larger sense of what you think is happening in society and what you think is happening in evangelical Christianity and what makes that battle take place.
Sure, you're absolutely right. This is not just about Donald Trump. And so I started the research for this book 15 years ago in the early 2000s. And it was when students brought me John Eldredge's Wild at Heart. And at that point, this was the early 2000s, and the Iraq War was just underway. And I was looking at how evangelical ideas of gender, and especially of masculinity, what makes for a Christian man, and people like Aldridge and James Dobson were turning to a really militaristic conception of faithful biblical manhood. And at the same time, I was looking at data coming out that white evangelicals disproportionately supported the Iraq War, condoned torture, aggressive foreign policy. And as a scholar of gender, I understood that these things went hand in hand. And so, yes, it goes back, my attention to this subject goes back more than 15 years. But then as a historian, I started to look back even longer and saw that we really needed to go to the early Cold War era, to the time of the Vietnam War, and see how Christian nationalism and the defense of God and country came together with a really rugged anti-feminist masculine ideal and white masculine ideal in the 1960s. And that really is at the heart of evangelical family values, and it has always been at the heart of the religious right.
So when I like to put up an image of the person's book behind me on the screen here, because it's sort of fun for me. And so I always search for the title of the book, and then I write cover and search on Google for Google images. And when I typed in Jesus and John Wayne cover, it didn't pull up a book cover. It pulled up a song, a cover version of a song by the Gaither band from 2008, which maybe you mentioned in the book and I haven't read that section. They write a song called Jesus and John Wayne. Is that obviously where you got the title? I'm hoping or guessing. And do you want to say something about that song? And I am staring at the lyrics, and I will have to say I listened to it twice already on this early morning, and I may never be the same. But it is. I mean, when I first saw the title of your book, and we met in February, and I knew your book was coming out in June. I thought, well, that's a really great title and a very clever title. Like, as a book critiquing male masculinity narratives inside of Christianity, boy, that's great. I don't know if I asked you then why you picked that title. Didn't really think a lot about it. And I thought, great title for a critique of masculine culture in Christianity. A terrible title for a song that we'll talk about in a minute. I would play it, but then Facebook will, not allow people to share the video. It really lands differently when it's the title to a song, and by the way, it's not a critique of male masculinity in the Gaither song.
Right.
That is where you got the title for the book.
So actually, I discovered the song by Googling, much as you did, because I was already working with the Jesus and John Wayne motif. Because what I discovered when I started looking at all of this literature on evangelical masculinity, and millions of books have been sold and read and devoured on this. And what I saw is that for all their talk of biblical authority and being Bible-believing Christians, white evangelicals didn't actually look to the Bible all that much in this popular literature on masculinity. Instead, they looked to Hollywood. They looked to Hollywood heroes. Mel Gibson's William Wallace is a huge favorite in this literature. But I was surprised to see that John Wayne just kept popping up in book after book after book as kind of, we all know that John Wayne is the icon of Christian manhood. And I thought, wait, really? And, so the kind of rugged, militant John Wayne, where the ends are going to justify the means, this real kind of cowboy masculinity, this righteous cause. Same with William Wallace of Braveheart, and soldiers, and so it was this mythical idea of masculinity that was driving Christian manhood. And actually, and this gets to the corrupted of faith part, transformed the very idea of Jesus, that Jesus is kind of remade in the
Mm.
image of John Wayne and in the image of Mel Gibson's heroes. So that's part of what I was getting at. So as I was starting to draw out John Wayne from this literature, that's when I went to Google and thought, has anybody else talked about that? And that's when I discovered the song.
Oh my gosh.
And the song itself actually is a little bit more complicated because it does set up a bit of a conflict between, I'm drawn to the faith of my mother, this gentle, tender, because that's always the flip side of this militant masculinity, is a very sweet, submissive femininity. But then, I'm also drawn to this more rugged ideal, and that maybe, Jesus is halfway in between. And I said, that conflict is actually nostalgic. We don't have that conflict in much of white evangelicalism anymore because they have remade Christ into a John Wayne figure, into a militant, aggressive protector. And so we really don't see that conflict much anymore.
Well, and so I'm just going to read the lyrics just so people kind of get a vibe for it. The video is totally worth watching too. It's sort of country set. A long-haired, older, rugged-looking faced man sings the video, and the lyrics are this: "Daddy was a cowboy, hard as a rock. Mama, she was quiet as a prayer." So right out of the chutes from your book is this idea that dads are tough, men are tough, women are quiet and submissive.
Yeah.
Daddy'd always tell me, "Son, you got to be tough." Mama kissed my cheek and said, "Play fair." I did my best to make them both proud of me, but it's never been an easy place to be. So here's the struggle of a young boy feeling like, I don't know if I should be more like my hard dad or my quiet, fair mom. And you almost get this feeling of how a lot of evangelical Christians talk about the Old Testament and the New Testament, like mean God in the Old Testament, the strict father, and then Jesus as the caring, meek sort of one. But it's curious that as the song goes, it starts to equate Jesus with the mother, right? I mean, and then this conflict now is mom and dad. And then it goes on and it says, do you mind if I read this? Is this okay?
No,
Because I think it just is so unbelievable. And then he says, "Somewhere between Jesus and John Wayne, a cowboy and a saint crossing the open range. I try to be more like you, Lord, but most days I know I ain't. I'm somewhere between Jesus and John Wayne. Mama's love was tender. Daddy's love was strong." So here you go again. "Both of them were there to help the weak." Right. This is also interesting that both the mean, strong, hard side, win at all costs, and the tender, caring, loving side are both there for the weak. Right. This is the conflict. "They taught me to stand up and fight for what is right, showed me how to turn the other cheek. Since there's a bit of both of them in me, then maybe I can be the best that I can ever hope to be. Yeah, I'm somewhere between Jesus and John Wayne, a cowboy and a saint. I try to be more like you, Lord, but most days I ain't. I'm somewhere between Jesus and John Wayne." And I mean, this idea that it's not just you suggesting that there's a John Wayne narrative in Christianity. For people who don't know the Gaithers, they represent a version of Christianity, and they're the soundtrack to many older people, especially, and they're the soundtrack to a certain style of Christianity that is that just permeates. And it feels like this little song is this great example of what you're getting at in the book. That as a historian, as a church historian, as a cultural observer, and as a Christian yourself, you're narrating in historic and culturally contemporary ways how you end up with people suggesting that there's a battle between being like Jesus or like John Wayne, or ideally a little bit of both.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
crazy.
Exactly. And yes, so I'm a cultural historian. So when I look at evangelicalism, I look at the lived religion. I'm interested in theology, but not exclusively in theology. And because I think that for most American evangelicals, they experience their faith through Christian radio, through Christian television, through, again, the ubiquity of Christian books on child rearing, on gender, on right, that this is the world that they inhabit. Not they're not reading kind of thick theological tomes for the most part. And when I think about evangelicalism too, you're right, you've got kind of the Gaither vocal brand, a band, which is a particular kind of strand of American evangelicalism. But what I tried to do in the book is map out this very diverse movement of white evangelicalism. And so I talk about, the homeschool movement, Bill Gothard, but then also James Dobson, and more modern manifestations of Mark Driscoll and John Aldridge, and the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, and the Gospel Coalition, right? And all of these things kind of come together through networks and alliances and draw boundaries of, who is inside evangelicalism and who are we going to kick out? Whose books are we going to sell? Who are we going to invite to these big conferences? And who's going to be on the outside? And so that was actually a huge task of this book, is just understanding, what are we even talking about when we talk about white evangelicalism? And we have to look at cultural products and at this cultural identity that's so critical to many evangelicals, and has been over the last 75 years.
You write in your book, you write, generations of evangelicals learned to be afraid of communists, feminists, liberals, secular humanists, quote, the homosexuals, the United Nations, the government, Muslims, and immigrants. And they were primed to respond to those fears by looking for a strong man to rescue them from danger, a man who embodied a God-given, testosterone-driven masculinity. As Robert Jeffries, who's a pastor at First Baptist Church in Dallas and a very prominent supporter of Donald Trump, as Robert Jeffries so eloquently expressed in the months before the 2016 election, quote, I want the meanest, toughest son of a you-know-what that I can find in that role, and I think that's where many evangelicals are. Now, I think it's curious that Robert Jeffries wants such a tough guy, he can't even say son of a bitch, right? He's so pure, he has to say a son of a you-know-what, right? Like, it's just this idea that we need a proxy, like almost the fact that he won't say that mean word, he wants someone else to say it on his behalf. This is the thing you're getting at, that these people are seeking, not even in a hidden way. It's not like I'm afraid of the changing subculture in America. I'm afraid that America's shifting from, this is just blatant. I want the meanest, toughest son of a you-know-what to be the president on our behalf. And you just ask yourself, how did the evangelical Christianity that some of us are familiar with give way to this? Like, I know it's always been around. Look, I mean, you go back to the Gospels and you've got the disciples being like, let's pull swords. If you, by the one gospel account, you've got Peter swinging a sword at a man's head and, cutting off his ear. So the idea that you're going to have masculine, violent, war-dripped following of Jesus, yeah, okay, that's been around. But as in that case, as in our case, the response to that is to say, put your sword away, right? Stop and heal the man's ear in this story, right? There's something Jesus is showing in this gospel story about not being the people of violence, instead being the people of healing. And so we're still having that argument. That's what happens. That's how it goes. It's the non-identical repetition. But what do you think caused the giveaway for, like, do you think it's just that people got quiet? Do you think these people like Jeffries and Jerry Falwell Jr. and pastors who I know who preach with a gun in their holster?
Yeah.
My friend Rob Schenck has taught me that so many people in the religious right, when he was involved in that, would never preach the gospel without a Bible in one hand and a pistol on their hip. It's just like, how did we give way to that being so normative as opposed to that being so exceptional?
Right. That's a huge question. So I guess I should say I'm a Calvinist, so I can always resort to original sin if you want to go back that far. But to me, it does come back to this question of power, right? And fundamentally, what is the gospel about? And you're right that Jesus of the gospel says, put your sword away. And his followers are constantly looking for this kind of warrior who's going to do what they want him to do and install them in places of power. And that is contrary to what, and that's what's so revolutionary about Christianity, about biblical Christianity, about the gospel of Christ, that Jesus kind of turns this upside down. But throughout Christian history, there is this strong tendency for Christians themselves to want to claim that power and to maintain that power. And once you have some of that power, it's very, very hard to let it go. And really, you can kind of see the history of 20th century evangelicalism as a history of evangelicals grasping that power, getting some of it in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and then absolutely wanting to maintain that. And you can see that in very specific individual cases. And that's one of the things that I look at in this book too. This is a story of kind of evangelicals and national politics, but it's also the story of individual evangelicals in their own churches, in their own organizations that model this kind of ruthless grasping for power. And the way that they do that, the way they maintain, they consolidate and maintain their own personal power is by inciting fear in their followers. And this works. So, and that's how they're able to drive donations. And that's how they're able to demand the absolute loyalty of their church members, of their donors, of their followers. And once that kind of clicked for me on an individual kind of local level, you can really see that pattern repeating itself at the national level as well.
Do you think this is where the anti-woman movements inside of certain parts of white evangelical Christianity, like women can't lead, women are the temptress, and women are the ones who cause the struggle for men, the sexual struggle for men, and women need to have a covering of, this is not to be too deep in the subculture, but kind of Bill Gothard world, that women always need some community led by a man that surrounds them and keeps them safe because they come from the lineage of Eve. Do you think that anti-woman piece is also a part of this kind of patriarchy and masculinity narrative, or do you think those two things are like running parallel to each other and occasionally crisscross? Because I know some women who are big into the biblical view of women don't like it when people like me say you constantly are subjugating women to male power by having that view. They don't necessarily give into that. So I didn't know if you had done a lot of research on that, and if you think they're really the same, or are they just are they paths that are crossing one another?
I would say they're two sides of the same coin, because this militant masculinity is justified in the name of protecting women and children and the vulnerable, and protecting the Christian America. And so, and at the same time, strong women, women's rights, feminism is absolutely positioned as probably the most dire threat to God-given, testosterone-driven masculinity. That is a constant motif in American evangelicalism. And that's why feminism is so bad, because it is weakening our boys who need to grow up to be strong men in order to protect this nation and to lead as God intended them to lead. So they are absolutely two sides of the same coin. And some women absolutely sense this. And I've heard from many of these women since this book published a month ago. But other women have been told and understand that this submissive femininity is the way of being a faithful Christian, right? That this is how this is taught. It is instilled in generations of young girls, that to be a good Christian means to submit to men, means to embrace your weaker femininity. And so there are many women who absolutely support this larger ideology, and they try to live their lives according to this plan. Again, some are able to do that. Many find that it's destructive to who they are, who God made them to be, and many end up walking away from their faith because they've been told that to be a Christian is to embrace this ideology.
You think there's any saving the evangelical community from that movement? I mean, I am just stunned that it still carries such weight in 2020. and that that this complementarianism view of leadership, or that women should be, from the song "Mama," she was quiet as a prayer. That it's just really hard to reckon how in 2020 that is still a stated belief of a significant portion of people who are otherwise fully embedded in culture. We're not talking about the Amish here. We're not talking even about Mennonite culture. We're talking about women who teach at universities and run nonprofits and run businesses and are explorers, also proclaiming a theological view that says, well, that's sort of how God made the created order, that women are submissive to men. I mean, first of all, it's not even a biblical notion. All right. I know we're not doing a Bible study right now on gender and how the Bible is, I think, pushing constantly for non-cultural gender conformity. Which I'd love to do with you sometime, by the way, because I think the biblical text is always putting women in positions where whether it's from Deborah the judge to Eve, all these narratives are breaking gender norms of their time, and I think should be breaking gender norms of ours. So setting aside the fact that sure, you can use the Bible for all sorts of things, but you're not getting that idea from there. Like, you might import it into there, in my view, and draw it from there, but you're going to have to work pretty hard to either ignore or to recast it. But do you think there's any getting rid of it in our society for the evangelical community, or is it just a struggle that's going to be there in perpetuity, at least through, our lifetime and maybe the lifetime of children and grandchildren?
And first, you're right to go back to kind of biblical interpretation. And the first book that I wrote is actually a history of Christian feminism and evangelical feminism. And that's really important to realize, that history can show us that things haven't always been this way, and that they were made this way by specific people at specific points in time, right? So that's actually really important to put forward. And that relates to your question of, is there hope for change? And there is, and we have to understand again that this is not, even though conservative white evangelicals love to use the word gospel, right? The gospel coalition, gospel truth. This is not the Christian gospel, right? This is one cultural interpretation, and we're all finite, and we all come to the text with our cultural lenses. But if we can just bracket this as one particular historical and cultural understanding, then I think that opens up, including for, quote unquote, Bible believing Christians, to rethink some of these things. But I will also say that my research has demonstrated that this is also very deeply entrenched. And for right now, I'm hearing some kind of never Trump evangelicals say, what we really need is a better political theology, and then we'll be out, then we won't be supporting Trump, or we just need to stop listening to conspiracy theories, and then we'll be fine. And that's not true. That we have to have a kind of full deconstruction of the family values evangelicalism, of ideas about gender and about sexuality and about the common good, frankly, and understand how we've gotten to this place, and before we can undo it. But I will also say, not to get too pessimistic, that we have to understand how power operates in American evangelicalism, that there are enormous pressures on individuals, leaders, and people in the pews to stay quiet, to not disrupt this ideology. And I know, because I've felt that myself, and I've heard from so many people since I've gone public with this research, who say, I agree 100%. I can't say anything or I will lose my job. Pastors know that they're going to be kicked out of their churches. And so we have to, I think it's just going to take a lot of acts of individual courage and a lot of efforts to offer kind of new institutions, to embolden people to speak out, to know that they're not alone, and to offer a place for those who need to leave their current places. So it's not going to be easy, but I think it can be done collectively, and that's what we really need in this moment.
Boy, I think you're so right. I mean, my experience in the last 30 years of being around a lot of church leaders and evangelical culture leaders, most people don't believe the stuff that they print in the books from their publishing houses. They don't believe the stuff that their church has on their own websites. They don't even believe the stuff they say quite the way they say it. They know that they're fulfilling a role and they're trying to keep the whole thing going. And the ends justifying the means is this perpetual well that they go to, right? They just keep going there and saying, well, we have to do that in order to get to this other thing, right? So I have a friend who's in a church that still doesn't allow women to lead in some way, and we keep talking about it. A big evangelical church in Texas, and they'll say, yeah, but here's the thing. We do all this really great work in, and then you name the part of the world they're doing work in. And if we tip over this apple cart, kids are going to get hungry, or we're not going to be able to work on malaria projects, or people aren't going to have clean water. Basically, is that what you want? I mean, this was World Vision, came up to this line and backed
Yeah,
away
yeah,
from it,
yeah.
right? About allowing people to follow the law in the state of Washington about their partners being included on their insurance. I mean, is
Mhm.
sort of deep benign sort of technical insurance law as you could get. But boy, the pushback came ferocious. And evangelicals said, fundamentally, we will let kids go without clean water and food if you allow gay people to have insurance through the organization's insurance plan. So this seems like it's the leadership crisis that we face. Is there's always a reason to say, yeah, but I have to. And I don't even think it's just I'll lose my job. I think it is for some people because as a working pastor for 30 years, a lot of us don't have a lot of other things we're very good at. So it's like we're in a little bit of trouble here. You're this like that parable: too weak to beg and too proud, or too weak to dig and too proud to beg. Um, but people make up this story in which they're the hero by doing something that is so not heroic by staying quiet on a whole range of issues, especially on issues of LGBTQ inclusion. And those letters all have meanings to them. And transgender is the biggest one. And I think the transgender bathroom movement and the anti-transgender movement in the evangelical church really gets to this whole issue of how fragile evangelicals feel about their own understanding of gender, which comes back to all the work you've done for your career. Do you think that's
Oh,
true?
definitely, definitely. So LGBTQ issues and particularly transgender absolutely disrupt this critical gender difference, which is the foundation to this entire ideology. The idea that God made men and women completely and utterly distinct, as Dobson says, every cell of their bodies, right? And so whatever is masculine, the opposite is feminine. And what that ends up doing is things like the fruits of the spirit, oh, those are feminine. And so again, it totally corrupts Christianity, because if you look at the Bible, it's this revolutionary text, and 99 point whatever percent of the verses are not specifically addressed to men or to women. And we have verses of there is neither male nor female in Christ. So something like transgender and LGBTQ issues generally are really disrupting that foundation on which conservative evangelicals have kind of hung all truth, all biblical truth. But I will say that the younger generation is not buying this, not nearly like older generations have. And I think there are a variety of reasons for this. But if you want to talk ends justifying means, I think that's tipping just a little bit,
Hmm.
because it's really hard for young evangelicals growing up today in this cultural context where they're also much less isolated than, say, somebody like myself was growing up in the 1980s and 90s, where that evangelical subculture had much more of a hold on us because we didn't have the internet, we didn't have Instagram, we didn't have we could grow up in more of a cultural bubble. I only listened to Christian music. I thought, secular music was sinful.
Did you
Um,
have a favorite band?
I mean, jars of clay, right?
Okay, fair enough.
so and there's many in my generation who, that's just, we grew up quite separately. And I think it's much harder now, except for the homeschool circles. It's much harder, and even then, to grow up in that kind of isolation. And now I see that. I teach at a Christian university, and my students who are coming into my classes now from evangelical backgrounds are so much more progressive, just because of the relationships, because of their cultural exposure, than they were even 5 years ago. And so I think that to set up this conservative ideology on gender, and we haven't even talked about race and sexuality, as the only way to be a quote unquote true biblical Christian is a recipe for disaster. And I think some evangelicals are sensing that. But it's just not going to be sustainable, I don't think, without a lot of real assertion of power that can get, well, it already is quite ugly. And even then, I think many of the younger generation are just going to walk away.
I hope that's true. I'm not. I gave up about a number of years ago on generational shift.
I say that with, and I'm questioning, because the problem is younger evangelicals grow up to be older evangelicals,
I
and
mean,
you can see that change. As a cultural historian, I will say I sense something is different now. Again, because that lock of the subculture isn't there anymore. I'm seeing it. Whether that's going to then lead to political, partisan shift, that's another question. There are a lot of variables.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and like we're all saying these days, I want to believe the scientists on this. So I want to believe you as a social scientist and historian, because you think the generation of 1968 and 69 and 70 and 71. Those are the baby boomers now that we say are the problem, right? So this idea that that the next generation is going to be the ones that lead us through, or as you know was sung in the 1980s when you're talking about, we believe the children are our future and they're going to lead us down this new path, and that Gen Xers are going to do it, or Gen Y is going to do it, or about 17 years ago or so, I spoke at Bethel Seminary, which is an evangelical seminary here, and I'm a graduate from that school, and I spoke at it, and I talked about this idea of complementarianism, and it was resurging there. And I just said that this is incoming students, first retreat in the fall of freshman year for seminary graduate students, and it went well with the students. I thought the faculty and the administration was not happy, and we had a meeting, and the provost of the school said, "Look, Doug, here's the thing. We know that students come in with this postmodern kind of open view that you're proclaiming. We recognize they come in with it, but we're here so they don't leave with it." Right? The whole point of these institutions is to take these cultural realities and to work against them, or to eliminate them, or to reshape. And that's the thing I think people don't recognize, that you do such a great job in the book of articulating and exposing, is these are not benign systems just kind of bumbling along. They're intentional movements of people who don't buy it, shaping people in a particular way so that they can stay for some reason, and it's hard for me to recognize what the rationale and the reason is, why they want to keep them inside these systems, but they're very committed to it. I think fundamentally because they believe that's what God wants them to do. I mean, I continue to grant people in this world, of which I consider myself a part too. By the way, so just so people know, like I wasn't raised an evangelical, but I converted into it as a 16-year-old, and I consider that to be my community. And I'm gonna, my DNA is all over the crime scene here, just like everybody else's, right? Like I'm not some outside observer saying, "Boy, you people in those glass houses should really shape up your attitude." I'm deeply rooted in this world too, and represent, that 20% of the evangelicals who wouldn't support this stuff. So when people say like 80% of evangelicals, this and that, well, there's this little remnant. There's this little 20% remnant over there that don't. And that group's got to get going. So I know we talked about this, the other day, but Look, if we just hope that generational transition is gonna catch this, that's the wave, and somehow those of us, and now I'm going to preach to my 50-year-old friends, if we think that our job is to pawn this off on our kids or grandkids and let them fix the problem that we've helped to bolster, first of all, that's really a terrible way to live your life, and I don't think it's going to work. I think we have to do the hard work in our generation because they're going to have enough issues of their own to be figuring out. They're going to look, if we can't figure out gender and race in a better way right now and the environment, what are they going to do with serious technological advances and AI and a global reconstituting of the planet? And I mean, there are so many problems facing generations to come. To burden them with this and be like, "Hey, hope you guys figure it out." We chose not to. I mean, we just sat back and said, "Let the kids fix it." It's really, and I'm not saying you're suggesting that at all. I'm not saying that you are.
No. And I think
I'm
you're
just
right.
lamenting at the lack of leadership of entire generations of religious leaders in this country.
Right. And again, you say that, we are complicit, those of us who are part of these communities, who have been part of these communities. And that's the deconstruction that we need to be doing right now, which is, even if right now, you're an evangelical who finds yourself in the 20% who doesn't support Donald Trump, and you can't just wash your hands of that and say, I'm on the right side of this. You need to look, how have you been complicit in these racial hierarchies, in these gender hierarchies, in this corruption of Christianity? How have you been shaped by this? And that's really what we all need to be doing right now. And in light of the Black Lives Matter movement, there's a really good opportunity, right? That conversation is happening, but it needs to keep happening. And it has to happen at a very, very deep level. But you're right, we can't just hand this over to the younger generation. And that I think that we can learn from looking back even to 2008, to the Obama election. And there we did see a shift in terms of the white evangelical vote by a few percentage points, and particularly strong among the younger generation. And what happened as a result? Conservative evangelical leaders and organizations cracked down. Absolutely. They're very explicit about, we need to enforce loyalty. We need to reclaim this younger generation, and we need to, again, consolidate our power. And they were panicked and they went to work. And we see the effects of that in 2016.
Can you say more about that? What what went on? Like, do you have any more
Yeah,
details
I mean,
about
people like
what was going on?
people that you don't even think of, or that some people might not think of as political, like Wayne Grudem, for example, comes out with this really thick, it's on my shelf here somewhere, really thick book on a Christian's guide to politics, essentially. And it is just the right-wing Republican playbook, step by step, on immigration, on border security, on Islam, on all of these things. This is Wayne Grudem, right? What did he do? He's the whole gender difference, biblical womanhood, biblical manhood, complementarianism. They see that these are all facets of the same ideology. And he and folks like Dobson, right? They are in cahoots, and they are pouring all sorts of resources into shaping the theology, the thinking of evangelicals through their writings, and working through their network of pastors to really get into evangelical churches, and also working on the national level with national political organizations and lobbying and so forth. So this is a concerted effort. And again, their eye is on that demographic slice, the younger evangelicals who betrayed their cause by voting for Obama in 2008. They were able to shore up some of that support already by 2012. And then again, we see that in 2016. So you're absolutely right. We can't just trust that time will change things, because conservative evangelicals are very active in ensuring that doesn't happen. And I think on the evangelical left, we haven't seen that kind of coordination for a variety of reasons, some of them actually good reasons, but we haven't seen the same effort to kind of combat the efforts on the right.
You've mentioned a couple times, and the book does a good job with this, of also engaging on the issues of race and the intersectionality of these issues. And it's something that actually the religious right that we're talking about here and some of these evangelical leaders, they're very aware of intersectionality too. I don't know that they want to use an academic term like intersectionality, partly
Mhm.
because it has section in there that makes them nervous. Uh, but there's this blending, right, of issues. And I just heard it yesterday on an NPR story of all things, where someone was critiquing, a reporter was reporting the critique of what's happening in Portland, and saying, some 60 days after the murder of George Floyd, this protest has now shifted to other issues and feels more like Occupy Wall Street than it does just about issues of race and police brutality. Almost like saying, you get permission to protest police brutality and police killing of black men, but you really don't get to move off of that into any other issue. And this is a societal problem and certainly a religious problem, to say, okay, I'll grant you that we shouldn't enslave people, or I'll grant you we shouldn't have laws against cultural or racial inclusion, or I'll grant you that police shouldn't kill people. But let's not let that seep into everything else. And it's the very seeping into everything else that one has to do, because you realize, and you've done it so well in the book, to lay out how this is the set of conditions in which all these varieties of fruit are growing. This is the soil that they're all growing up in, and they're drawing the nutrients, in this overly belabored metaphor, they're drawing the nutrients from the same place, so they're going to be delivering they're different vehicles to deliver the same outcomes.
Yeah, and history makes this very plain. So I talked about the backdrop of Vietnam and the Cold War and anti-feminism, but there's another context that's critically important here, and that's the civil rights movement. And a lot of evangelicals, well, many were kind of tepid supporters of, the most basic civil rights. But once the Civil Rights Act was passed in in the Voting Rights Act, 1964, 1965, they're like, okay, that's good. And then they just stopped talking about race. They stopped talking about segregationism because that's not politically correct, right? That gets them into too much trouble. But they instead start talking about other kind of adjacent issues. And honestly, we have to take a hard look at family values evangelicalism and look at how, part of this mobilization was the authority of parents over against the federal government, the IRS and Christian schools, which were actually segregation academies in many instances, that these issues of parental rights and anti-federal government only make sense in the civil rights context, right? Federal government was forcing civil rights on Americans and on American families. And that was disrupting the power of not just parents, but we know who holds the power in the parental relationship. It's the patriarch, the white patriarch. And so this is white patriarchal authority. And where I really started to see this was in their own literature, although they don't talk about race and they
Mm.
don't identify their whiteness, all of the heroes that they celebrate, and they love heroes, all of the heroes are white men. And in many cases, they are white men who are dominating non-white peoples. So Teddy Roosevelt and American Empire, their mythical understanding of the American cowboy is absolutely a white image. They love to celebrate the Alamo, and then just take John Wayne and all of his movies, right? That this is a very white militant ideal. They do not think that non-white men should be militant. Those are the problems that we need to solve and that we need to defend against and protect against. Immigrants, refugees, Mexicans coming across the border. This all makes sense that this is a very white masculine ideal and a white militancy. And in the conclusion of the book, I talk about going into a Hobby Lobby store. And, Hobby Lobby, dear to the hearts of many white evangelicals. If
I
you
mean,
look at
where would scrapbooks be without
well, exactly. And of
Hobby
course,
Lobby?
the Green family has been very politically active as well. But I think it's important just as a kind of opening to a window onto white evangelical culture. And if on the shelves you're going to find essentially well, you see a lot of pro law enforcement material, memorabilia, little knickknacks. You see anti kind of Black Lives Matter in that, I stand for the flag, kneel for the Lord. Colin Kaepernick is not celebrated there. Tim Tebow is. And, a very kind of white, masculine ideal, militant ideal, pro law enforcement. And there's nothing in terms of civil rights, in terms of, Black Christianity. And so when you hear people talk about, evangelicalism is diverse, and we want to include Black Protestants as evangelicals, and we want to include global evangelicals as part of this mix, I really push back against that and say, in the United States, white evangelicalism is a distinct cultural and historical religious movement, and there are all of these values that come alongside with it, not just alongside it, that are at the heart of it. And we have to acknowledge that. And then as people of faith, and perhaps as white evangelicals ourselves, need to look and say, which parts of this package are actually biblical Christianity, and which are corruption.
Yeah, I mean, boy, it's so well said, and such a difficult. It's difficult to trust that any of us are going to do the things we have to do to kind of break the cabal open, right? I mean, you start the book by stating that where Donald Trump said his "I'm not going to lose any voters, even if I stood out on Fifth Avenue and shot someone." He said that at Dordt College in Iowa, a little reformed Christian Reformed Church school. Which, first of all, what was Donald Trump doing at that little place, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you went to college there, and say in the book you stood on the very same stage and led prayers from the very spot where Donald Trump, pervertedly said such things. But the fact that he was there, and you teach at Calvin College, which is a part of that same tribe of people. I work in the religion industry and have for all of these years, and write books published by Zondervan in the past for and and all of that whole world. And when you're inside this, you just realize, boy, I mean, can any of these institutions continue to be around when through and through they're just designed to make this white experience normative? And not only normative to America, like, well, look, it is the majority and it was founded, but like normative to God. That's the thing that you realize in these communities, right? Is that, you think of Megyn Kelly. We just watched this movie Bombshell the other day, and I was reminded of her nonsense about Santa Claus being white, if you remember that whole thing. But that rooted out of Jesus was white. Like, people will give you a good hard fight about that. And somehow equating modern day Jewish people in the United States that often get put into the white faith leader category with a first century Palestinian, right? As if that's the same.
Yeah.
But there wasn't even, like, whiteness was created by society to empower some people over other people. So not only was Jesus not white, the concept didn't exist then. And the idea that you're somehow going to use this white normative thing for the narrative of God, I just keep wondering, like, do people like you and me and others, do we have to create new institutions? Do we have to leave those institutions? Does everybody need to boycott those? Like, what do you think is and look, all of the above, all hands on deck is a great response to all this, right? We should do all the things. But do you have a sense about, what needs to happen in the next 30 years so that we look back on this stage, not the way people are looking back on 1990 and saying, well, there was a movement back then? Because Donald Trump and his election, I think, is a serious threat to the well-being of this planet and everyone who lives on it. Like, I just truly believe that his way of being president and the people who are empowered by his way of being president represent a true threat to this planet and to all.
Yeah. So to go back to, Donald Trump appearing on the stage of Dordt College, what was he doing there? Well, all of the Republican candidates swing through Northwest Iowa because of the primaries, or the caucuses, I should say. and the importance of the state. But when I heard him, and this was one of the first times, if not the first time, that Robert Jeffress actually opened for Trump, it was at Dort. And I watched that on live stream because I wasn't there. I'm in Michigan, but initially I thought, oh, he has no idea where he is. Because I knew for a fact that the vast majority of Dort professors and students were not Donald Trump fans. That wasn't their Christianity. And I just thought, oh, he's stupid, right? Because he didn't do his research, and they saw a Christian college and they assume, there's one kind of Christian, and it's the Robert Jeffress kind of Christian or the Paula White kind of Christian. And so, he was speaking to the wrong audience. That's what I thought when I was watching. But if you look at, the voting returns of Sioux County, Iowa in 2016, you see that more than 81% went for Donald Trump in the end. And so that's something that I've had to wrestle with. On the one hand, there is resistance, there is uneasiness, ambivalence within the white evangelical community, including those who have voted for Trump. But what needs to change? Again, I really think we need courage to speak out. But we also need, the truth is the threats are real for many institutions. And these are coordinated threats. Dobson has worked to marshal, his followers to put pressure on Christian universities or Christian colleges who will step out of line because he can swing all sorts of, prospective students, or at least their parents, that's not a safe college anymore. You can avoid that. There are big donors who are going to withdraw their support if you say the wrong thing. So I think those of us who have the freedom to speak out absolutely need to use that freedom. And I do. I'm a professor. I have academic freedom. And I believe that I'm working very much in line with my own institution, where we are called to be agents of renewal for Christ. And that's what I'm doing. And I'm working in good faith that that's how it's understood. But then we also need, I think, we need some support. I think we need some financial support, because the religious right has marshaled so much in terms of just plain dollars to fund think tanks, to fund organizations, and to exert pressure through that funding. And if we could have a little bit more of that in support of a different kind of Christianity, I think that could embolden certain leaders to make some risky choices. And World Vision you talked about, and we saw what happened there. I think this is a dilemma that many Christian colleges, Christian universities face, and a lot of other publishers, organizations. And if they knew that it wasn't so one-sided in terms of the pushback they were going to get or the support that they were going to get, that we can maybe start to move in a different direction. But really, it takes all of us, wherever we're located, to look around and say, what can I do with my resources and in my place?
Well, and your book is an important part of that. So this is Kristen Dumais. The book is Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. Great title, great subtitle, even more great book, and great author. So, hey, thanks. And do you have other things up and coming that if people want to follow you more, that they could be involved in the COVID moment?
Sure. You can follow me on Twitter at KKDumez, KKDUMEZ. I also have an author page on Facebook where I post very regularly. Someday I'll be traveling again and speaking. Right now I'm just doing a lot of radio and Zoom conversations. But it's a great community, and that's also KK Dumais, Kristen Kobus Dumais, my author page. And it's been a really great place to just connect with other Christians who are trying to do the same things.
So how Hey, I hope you really enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. It was back in July when Kristen and I recorded that conversation. So if you've been a regular listener to the podcast, you may have heard it there. But boy, listening to it again, it's just as fresh as it was back in July. So many things have changed and become more intense, and so many things have stayed just as they are. So the work continues. We appreciate you being around and being part of this effort with us. Appreciate you being a part of the Vote Common Good world. If you're not on our email list, hey, head over to votecommongood.com, and we'd love to stay in touch with you. We send out I think, a good amount of material and a good amount of resources, including an invitation to a webinar that Kristen's going to be a part of that we're going to do for the month of April. So in April, on Tuesday nights, it's a webinar on the threat of Christian nationalism and what a faithful response can be. It's really designed for leaders, for individuals who are talking to friends or family who are caught up in Christian nationalism and maybe don't even know what it is. So if you're in a faith community or know people in a faith community or have someone that you feel like you should be talking to about these issues, on Tuesday nights, all the information is going to come to you through all of these channels. You can keep your eye out for it. The details will be at votecommongood.com. And it's not only Kristen Dumais is going to be a part of this, but a person that wrote a book called Power Worshippers, an author pair that wrote a book called Taking the Country Back for God, and other professionals who know so much about Christian nationalism and what led to the insurrection on January 6th and has caused so much destruction and pain in parts of our society and all across our globe. So we'd love for you to be a part of that. That's all stuff you'll get if you're over there at votecommongood.com. And so we appreciate you being a part of this. And we will see you tomorrow when it's Science Day, one of my favorite days around the Vote Common Good world. So thanks for being a part of our podcast. Thanks for being a part of our live stream. And we will see you tomorrow.